I want to welcome Mike and AJ back to another Provident webinar, as well as those listeners who've joined us for previous webinars. If this is your first time to join us, thank you for being with us, and I hope you return for future webinars. You can view previous webinars at www.providentins.com under the Training and Resources section. Please also check out the podcast we've recorded through your favorite podcast app. A Google search of station 1902 podcast will provide you with the links you need. Tonight's presentation, Good Incident Rehab Saves Lives, is a subject that I feel very strongly about and have advocated for years. I know Mike and AJ feel very strongly about the subject as well. So quickly, I'll go through some slides introducing those of you who are new to Provident to what Provident is all about. Provident got its start in 1902 as an independent insurance agency in the Pittsburgh area. In 1928, Provident began serving fire departments with a customized blanket accident and health policy. Today, we provide volunteer combination and career fire departments and emergency medical responders with a multitude of programs. We also offer some special risk and transportation insurance programs. This is the 6th year that Provident's been voted by the Insurance Business of America as one of the top insurance employers. The programs that Provident do offer to emergency services are accident and health program. In many states, it might be referred to as the Fireman's Relief Insurance. If you're an accident and health client of ours, you and your immediate family members have access to our first responder assistance program. We also have a 24-hour accidental death and dismemberment policy that would help you provide coverages and insurance coverage to your members even when they're off duty from the fire department. We have a group term life policy, critical illness and cancer, which obviously pays a living benefit if someone's diagnosed with cancer, heart attack, stroke, or renal failure. And then, of course, our Fire Plus property and casualty insurance, where we insure your things, your apparatus, and your buildings. And if you're a property and casualty client, you have free access to our online training platform through Fire Rescue One called the Fire Plus Academy. So tonight, and without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm even going to mute myself and even shut my camera off. Take it away, Mike. You're muted, Mike.
That's an amateurish mistake, but yeah, so thank you very much, Chief. So I'm Mike McEvoy, and you see with me AJ Heightman. We're going to talk this evening about a subject that we're both very passionate about, and that has to do with incident rehab. And AJ reminded me when we were putting this slide deck together that we're not just talking about firefighters. In general, when you hear the term rehab, you think about an NFPA standard. The standard 1584 was a best practice until about 10, 12 years ago when it became an actual standard. And it's been through 3 iterations now. We have written a couple textbooks about it. Brian Bledsoe, who's an EMS author, Dave Hostler, who currently is at the University of Buffalo in New York, a researcher on rehab, and myself have published this sort of handbook, textbook on rehab and medical monitoring, and is in its 2nd edition now. Reflects a lot of what was in the NFPA standards, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Neither AJ nor I have any financial disclosures, and we're not going to talk about anything that's an unlabeled or unapproved use of a drug or a product. And this is the standard that the National Fire Protection Agency released on firefighter rehab. It got updated just a year ago, really, in what is now its third version as a standard, fifth version as a publication. You can access any of those NFPA standards just by typing nfpa.org / and the number of the standard. And there's a way to actually look at it for free. If you want to print it, you have to pay for it. But we'll talk about some of the very recent changes to the standard, because it's constantly evolving based on research that folks have been doing that pertains to rehab of not just firefighters, but as you see in the title there, members operating on emergency scenes or members doing training exercises. So that could be police, could be fire, could be EMS. And so our first question then is why would we do rehab? And I think if we think about firefighting, and this is probably more true in a fire scene than it is in most of the other public safety careers, firefighting is almost and sometimes more taxing than professional sports. And if we think about what do professional sports players do to win games, they practice, they stay fit, they get really good medical care, and they pay very close attention to hydration, rest, and nutrition. And hydration, rest, and nutrition are pretty much what we're going to talk about tonight. But I want to make a point that our drilling and our practicing is essential to our success on the fire ground, our success on the EMS ground, and our success anywhere in public safety. And so is fitness, and so is good medical care. And so those are precursors in NFPA standards to what is in the standard for 1584. And our goal, if we're doing rehab, is really to provide sufficient recovery to continue working safely, and something that Denise Smith and her colleagues at the University of Fire Science in Illinois and Skidmore College, where she does research, have discovered over the course of the last 15 years, is that you cannot return to your baseline physiologically in simple 20 to 30 minutes of rest. It probably takes an hour to an hour and a half, and maybe longer for some individuals to truly recover. So the goal of rehab is to get you sufficiently recovered so that you can continue to perform on the emergency operations scene. And that then raises the question of when would we rehab? And the criteria has changed considerably over time. And the current NFPA 1584 standard says whenever you see physical or mental demands of an incident or training exercise pose a risk to those members, then there should be some rehab process. And AJ,
and Mike,
you have a ton of examples of that.
yeah, and I just want to add, the word potential in there is really significant, because if you even sense that you're going to be at a protected incident or incident where people are stressing, you need to go into a rehab mode. And I also want to point out that because we're talking about all emergency responders, not everybody likes to have to do rehab, but as a standard, believe me, the insurance agencies and the attorneys know that it exists. And when we tell somebody that they need to go to rehab, they need to go to rehab. So these are pretty powerful standards, but the way Mike and I approach it, I hope that you understand, is that we see the need for it as just good care. I learned about rehab from a fire chief that many of you may not even know, Alan Brunacini from the Phoenix Fire Department. Started talking about rehab long before it was fashionable. And I drank the Kool-Aid and really believed in it, and understand all of his thinking on it. So Mike, go ahead.
So that kind of brings us to criteria. And this is something that has changed again last year in the iteration of the standard. And it basically says if you're trying to find something on the fire ground that would help to mark when you need to rehab, it's after you use a single bottle. And we have all kinds of bottles that we use, 90-minute bottles, 30-minute bottles, et cetera, et cetera. And if you're not on air, you're doing something else that's a strenuous activity, 40 minutes of intense work would kind of be a marker where we should think about that. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself right now, that's a wide variety and a huge span of when somebody would actually rehab. So could you adjust that? And in fact, supervisor, a company officer, somebody who's on the scene in charge of a crew is permitted to adjust those timeframes depending on the work conditions or the environmental conditions. And I give the example sometimes of Yuma, Arizona, where a heat index there in a summer day could be as high as 140, 150 degrees. And that initial team that pulls lines up to the structure that's on fire is not even going to make an initial attack, because once they get the lines laid, they're pretty well ready for rehab themselves. They have another team that comes in and does an initial attack. So depending on the circumstances, the environmental, the workload, the people who are working with you, those terms could be changed.
The earlier guidelines used to say after 2 air bottle changes. And so what many departments do now when they're at a scene where they feel that that's still applicable, the IC may get on the radio and say, we're doing rehab after every two bottles. And then you know that after you get your first change, after your second change, you're going to have to stay in rehab for a little bit. And, you know, rehab is not a prison. It's actually for your own health. And we'll get into that.
And we'll talk about this. They're scalable. I mean, you may do some informal rehab after the first bottle. So some markers as to when it's appropriate to consider environmental conditions are what I had referred to earlier, the heat index. And the heat index is basically taking humidity and temperature, putting it on this chart, and figuring out when it might be appropriate to use a little bit lower standard for getting your people into rehab. There's an app that OSHA just came out with that's called a heat index calculator, which does the calculation for you just by using your phone's GPS coordinates and some weather information, and gives you the heat index where you happen to be standing. So an interesting way that you can do that, I know in my home county, when we have a heat index over 95, we automatically send ambulance to every single fire call, whether it's a structure fire or a flooded basement or any situation that they're in, because we consider that 95 heat index to be sort of a cutoff threshold where there's a lot of risk to people who are responding. AJ could talk a little bit about cold weather. Here's AJ doing some training in the snow.
And yeah, we talk about heat all the time, but we can have some pretty significant problems with people getting hypothermic. So there is a wind chill chart that Mike has up there that I usually tell people to have in their clipboard for rehab, so you can begin to rehab people. But I do want to point out one of the important things is whoever's on that initial attack, those are the folks that are working really, really hard. And those are the ones that are probably going to need rehab the soonest and for a protracted period of time, because they've really gotten there early and did the early attack. But if they happen to get doused with water and they're totally soaked, they can pretty much get hypothermia in a matter of minutes, as you can see from the chart here. And you could get on your phone and ask Siri to tell you what the wind chill, what the wind speed is at your local airport, and you'll have that parameter, and you could also find out what the temperature is. So it's not that hard to use these charts once you get used to it.
So I mentioned this earlier, and we definitely need to think about rehab being scalable in the same way as we scale hazmat from the awareness level up to the technician level. And if you think about a simple room and contents fire or a ambulance call where you're doing a long extrication, you need 4 things to accomplish rehab. You need some place for people to sit down, take off their gear, some shelter from the elements, and fluids. And if you threw a case of water on every piece of apparatus, you'd probably have everything that you need on any rescue, any engine, any ambulance in order to do informal rehab. When we talk about a more formal operation, we again have an addition that got made in this last round of NFPA standards, and that's to include some sort of decon operation and have people do some wet or dry decon, depending on your department policy, prior to them entering the area where they're going to doff their gear and store the gear that they have, get new cylinders, that sort of thing. So people are going into rehab deconned and with a minimal amount of gear on them. They then can do some rest and hydrate themselves, go to a medical evaluation section, and you have ambulances that are nearby that would help if they had an emergency or decided that they needed treatment. They leave the rehab area and then go into a treatment area. So any comment about this, AJ?
Well, we don't have a lot of time here, but both Mike and I have a gazillion slides and examples of tips and tricks and equipment that could be used. It's amazing what you could do with a little giant ladder and a couple of tarps to stop wind from coming in and affecting where you're rehabbing people. And you can ask almost anybody in a neighborhood to bring lawn chairs and things out, and they'll be bringing you ice and things you can't even imagine if they see that you're setting up some kind of a rehab for your firefighters. And then the other important thing is that I always tell people that we're going to do rehab at any of the major scenes that we're at, because the first thing we put down is a red tarp, and we set up some gear around there, and that's where we're doing rehab. Now, if a firefighter falls through the roof, rehab becomes the start of our MCI area. And so it's nice if you indoctrinate people that rehab, again, scalable, oxygen, vital sign information, hydration information, a kit or two, trauma, etc. And then if something goes bad, you're not caught with your hands in your pants.
So one of the questions that got posted in chat is, how is time factored into some of these decisions? And I think that's a definite piece of the equation that has to be thought about by the folks who are there on the scene. And there's a lot of things in this whole environment that have to do with the ages of the people that are there, their physical fitness, the condition, the environmental conditions. And we're going to cover that a bit more later on in the program to talk about the variations in the people that we're dealing with. And I think that's important to keep in mind, is that there's really
and time wise, the guidelines that I used to write and operating procedures said that the paramedic had the option to hold somebody in rehab. So if you feel somebody's good to go and they all want to get back into the battle, then you sign them off on your sheet and you let them go. Nobody's checking the sheet but you. And so if you see somebody my age or younger that seems to be struggling and has a beet red face and a blood pressure that's off the scale, you just say, I need to keep you in rehab a little longer. And when you work with your fire departments and you establish formal rehab, that's what it's got to say. It's for the good of the member if you tell them that they have to stay, because you may end up triaging them out to go into an ambulance and off to a hospital. We find a lot of maladies, and Mike could talk about that. When people come into rehab, they don't tell us that they have AFib. They don't tell us that they have low blood pressure or high blood pressure normally. And then we find them way off the scale because they've been beaten through a roof somewhere. Go ahead, Mike.
So I real worlded this slide. I don't know how anyone gets 2 ambulances at a scene, so I just took one of the ambulances out there, which is probably more practical.
Okay.
Well, hydration. I want to pick up the pace a little bit just to move through some of this discussion about hydration, because I think for many people this is probably going to be repetitive, but dehydration is a major issue on a fire ground. Dehydration is a major issue to all emergency responders who walk around day to day, by and large, a little bit more dehydrated than the population is. And you could see people become ill from being dehydrated. And so sometimes on the fire ground, when someone's nauseous and vomiting, it's difficult to ascertain the cause of that, but oftentimes has something to do with their hydration. And so do injuries. People are more prone to injury when they're dehydrated. So the best way to hydrate yourself is with water. And one of the things that we forget about quite a bit is that we take in most of the water that we need during the course of a day from food. And it's really not a necessity to replace water with water. We eat meals when we come back to the firehouse, come back to the ambulance station, and we take in about 3.5 liters of water a day in our food. So there's a need to drink, certainly, to stay hydrated, but food is a major source of hydration for most folks. We're starting to get a grip on beverages. And so you think about how beverage science has evolved. We have a ton of different things that have come in and gone out of the NFPA standard. And I think that today we have a much better understanding on what it is that we need to use on the fire ground for hydration. And one of those suggested things is a sports drink. And a sports drink has some benefit, probably because it contains carbohydrates, which is an energy booster. And so one of the current recommendations of NFPA is to not use sports drinks that are sugar-free. You want sports drinks that have electrolytes and carbohydrates, and probably don't need those until well into an incident. Water suffices for most of the calls that we're on. And another piece of sports drink information is that the manufacturers that make these concentrate them to an ideal gastric emptying time. In other words, they have an osmolality that's designed to get them to move through your stomach at an optimal speed. If you dilute them, or if you super concentrate them, say you're making them with a powder, you're probably going to cause somebody to develop some nausea and vomiting because they won't move through the gut at the speed that they were intended. So when you use sports drinks, ideally you use them at the concentration that they're manufactured at. Energy drinks is something that we see quite commonly, especially with younger folks in emergency services. And I'm talking about not sports drinks, but drinks that have some sort of caffeine, other kinds of ingredients in them that are marketed as a physical or a mental stimulant. And we see the use of these quite a bit as performance enhancers. However, there's a very, very clear association with arrhythmias, seizures, hospitalizations, and deaths. And those particularly affect younger individuals. And by that, I mean people under 30. So the current recommendation of NFPA is that energy drinks are bad for our firefighters, for our medics, for our police officers, anytime, whether they're on duty or off duty. And they're particularly bad for younger individuals. So that's a recommendation that I think we have to pay some credence to when we're thinking about what people consume in the course of a day, which leads me to caffeine that was banned in 2 editions ago in NFPA 1584 because it was believed that when you drank coffee, you diuresed yourself. It was like taking some Lasix. And multiple studies now have proven that to be a myth. The question, though, is if you need caffeine, what is a super high level where you could run into some problems? So conveniently, a study was done on firefighters using low-level caffeine. So a typical cup of coffee that you or I might drink would have 200, maybe 300 milligrams of caffeine in it. If you drank a couple cups of coffee, you're probably getting up towards the 500 milligram level. And what they found in these studies, long story short, is that you did see an initial increase in urine output when you drank caffeine. But then if you waited over the course of a 24-hour period, your net hydration status would be the same as if you had drank an equivalent amount of water. Because while the urine output went up initially, it came back down and stayed below baseline for a period of time after that. So bottom line, there's no real evidence to suggest that low to moderate levels of caffeine, less than 300 milligrams, would alter your hydration status at rest or during exercise. And if you follow sports medicine today, one of the things that you see, and especially for folks like myself and AJ, is if we get up in the middle of the night, we need a cup of coffee for our mental alertness when we're doing something in emergency services. So there may be some benefit to that in controlled amounts. So the question then is, how do you actually decide whether your hydration is good or bad? And there's a bunch of ways to do that. Using a scale on the Fireground would be the best way, but in order to use the scale, you have to have your clothes off, which is impractical. We have talked over the years about urine charts, and you see these hanging in many fire stations, ambulance stations, that you can sort of get an idea of your hydration status by the color of your urine. However, what you need to understand about urine charts is this is good only for your first void of the day. So when you first get up in the morning, this color chart will give you some information about your hydration status. It's relatively useless at any other point during the day, because now you've consumed fluids and you've altered what the color of your urine is going to look like based on things that you drank. So if you put those two together and you take body weight and you take urine color, you can actually, using that information, weigh yourself 3 mornings in a row when you're in the locker room changing into your uniform. Step on the scale, get a weight, look at your urine, your first void of the day. And if you have 3 days where you have the same weight and you're in a hydrated state, 1, 2, or 3 on the urine, that weight could serve as your baseline weight. You come back from a situation where you've sweated like a pig for a couple hours and you want to see how much volume you lost. You can use your baseline weight and the weight that you get on return to the station when you're taking a shower and cleaning up to give you a sense of how much fluid you've actually lost. And each liter equates to 2.2 pounds of weight. So if you lost 4 pounds, you'd need 1.5 liters of fluid, which doesn't necessarily have to come from drinking. It could come from food that you eat if you're going to eat a meal while you're back at the station. Which brings us to the next topic, and that's calories. Clearly, this is a timing thing. If you're responding to a call and you're working a fire for 2 or 3 hours that started right when you were about to sit down for dinner, you're going to need some food sooner than you would if it occurred at 2 o'clock in the morning. But we look at the things that we need under stressful situations, and of all the things that we can eat, most of the time carbohydrate sources of food are going to be the things that we would want on the Fireground, and particularly difficult to get at 2 o'clock in the morning, because the worst thing to eat is pizza, probably. The best thing to have would be some sandwiches, some healthy snacks that are difficult to get at 2 o'clock in the morning. And those are things that we have to think about. How can we get prepackaged things that would actually contain carbohydrate and help people in that situation? Anything to say about that, AJ?
Well, it's just there's a couple companies that actually offer some really good prepackaged sandwiches that have a shelf life of 1 year or 2. And I've used them during training, and people didn't even know the difference between freshly made sandwich and one that's prepackaged. So that's something to think about. The other thing I did want to mention is that Dan Patterson from the University of Pittsburgh has done some tremendous work on stress, on sleep deprivation, on shift schedules and showed actually that a little bit of caffeine is pretty good for you, actually, to keep you going during a shift when you're getting tired. And he also shows the evidence that coming to work with sleep deprivation is as bad as going in with alcohol on you. So look up that. There's a really good article. You can look up association between poor sleep, fatigue, and safety outcomes in emergency medical services by Daniel Patterson. Cooling, we'll talk about now. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah. And I just want to remind people, there's a Q&A box up on your screen and somewhere on your Zoom screen. And if you have a question, you feel free to type it in there. We can either hit it while we're talking, or if we have time at the end, we can cover some questions. So cooling and warming have changed a lot through research that Gavin Horn and Denise Smith have done, looking at active cooling versus passive cooling. And one of the things that we understand now is that no matter what you do on the fire ground, people's temperatures continue to rise for about 20 minutes when they come out of an environment where they've been working really hard. And that means that if we actively cool, we passively cool, we don't cool, we're still going to see temperatures increase. So the current thought is that we initially should passively cool everybody. And passive cooling means take your helmet off, take your hood off, take your gloves, your FCBA, and then remove your coat if you can, and open up your bunker pants. Preferably take your bunker pants off, but that doesn't usually sit well with a lot of folks on the fire ground. But open the top of the bunker pants, unvelcro that piece, undo the hook, and open the top of the pants. If you can lower them to knee level, that helps even more. But just the mere opening of the pants gives you a 20% greater cooling passively. And that, in most environments that we work in, is enough to get people cooled off. If an individual is showing some signs of heat stress, you may need to do some active cooling. Putting somebody in a cooler area, like this nice truck that the Maryland folks have, is also passive cooling. So putting somebody in an air-conditioned room in a cooler building, that's passive cooling just as well. Wet towels are something that we've talked about for years as being a helpful tool for actively cooling. And in fact, we find that they're less optimal than some of the more active cooling devices like vests that people wear. However, they're preferred by folks on the fire ground. And we've used a 3-bucket system with ice in one, rinse water in another, some bleach in another. And I would say we shouldn't throw those buckets away, because we have a really good use for active cooling with those now. When somebody's showing signs or symptoms of heat stress, we should switch from passive cooling to active cooling. One of the best active cooling methods is a bucket of ice water that you put each arm in, and that circulates all of the blood in the body through each bucket about 5 times a minute, and basically quickly cools an individual who is overheated or showing some signs of heat stress. And that's what you see going on with this young fellow here. He's got both arms in ice buckets, and it's cooling him off pretty quickly. You could buy a chair for a couple $100 that has arms that you put in to the chair that filled with ice and water on both sides. And I think the bucket is cheaper. That's probably worth it.
And I might add that those firefighters, once they experience a good procedure of active cooling, the next fire scene, they'll look for you and they'll want to do it again, because they realize that they felt so good after 5 or 10 minutes. And I like to put them in an environment like that, put a wet towel around their neck, give them a wet towel for the top of their head, and then give them a dry towel to dry off, and they cool off with the wind and the arms in the bucket, and they're off to the races. It's generally pretty easy if you tell them when they come in to get an air bottle changed to just off their turnout coat and sit them in a chair and just start some rehab while you're giving them a fresh air bottle. They won't even realize that they've been rehabbed sometimes. Here's a bottle of water. Take this down. Remember to take your blood pressure, your pulse. We'll talk about that now, what the do's and don'ts are. Mike?
So yeah, so find a sheltered area. Don't be in direct sun. Start passive cooling with folks immediately, primarily by removing gear. Active cooling if you're really hot or showing signs of heat stress, or if you're in a very humid locality. And then when we say rest, we're talking about 20 minutes of rest, at least initially. And things to avoid are using fans to cool large areas. That's relatively ineffective, and then generally makes people wet, which is a problem when you're going back onto a fire ground. Don't trust what you think your temperature is. We lose our sense of when we're overheated, when we're underheated. Misting fans don't work in a humid environment. Once you see humidity go up above 90% or so, even Walt Disney turns their fans off when the humidity gets very high in the areas where they run parks. Pay attention to wet PPE. We should have some dry t-shirts for people. We should probably have access to additional gear if PPE gets soaking wet. And definitely you don't want your gear in the rehab area, because we know that gear off gases things that it was exposed to inside the fire ground, and that's not the best thing to bring into a rehab environment. So the counterbalance to that is warming, and AJ has some slides of warming tents like this one.
Yeah, you could get very exorbitant. This is a FDNY tent with extra lighting that they set up at big scenes, but you don't always, like I said, have to get all that fancy. A couple of tarps and a couple of ladders and, tight poles, and you could jury rig some assembly. I think we have some other slides in here to show you, but it's important to get people out of the wind. At departments that I've worked with, we would ask members to bring in their old sweatsuits, and we'd mark XL or XXL on them and have them all separated. And at a major scene, we'd bring those with our rehab gear. And if somebody is soaking wet, we put them in, close the windows off on an ambulance, let them strip down and get a nice warm sweatsuit on and put their turnout gear back on. Next slide, Mike.
Oh,
I also like having the availability of buses is good at almost any scene. And Mike, as an emergency manager, knows this, that we could use it to transport people that are priority 3s to the hospital, but we could also use it as a great windbreak when we're at cold weather. And that nursing home that's in your community is not using their bingo bus at 2 o'clock in the morning. So if you set up an agreement with them, like I've done in many systems, and you call them and they have a spare set of keys, you can have co-signed insurance waivers to be able to take a bus or get a bus at your scene. And I've also had agreements with bus companies where they say, well, we'll send you a bus, but you're going to have to pay. Well, I don't really care. If you're going to send me a supervisor at $30 an hour, I'll guarantee them $100 before they even pull out of the garage. That bus is very valuable for a lot of different reasons, for cooling as well as for heating. Go ahead, Mike.
so that brings us to the most controversial part of rehab. And when we get EMS involved in this and we talk about recovery, we're really in many ways uncharted territory and things that we're trying to get our arms around. But what should happen in rehab is somebody shows up with no significant complaints. They should be encouraged to drink at least 8 ounces of fluid, which is 1 plastic bottle of water. An EMT or higher level person should do a visual evaluation. And this is, NFPA tries to spell everything out. They've spelled out what we call a look test. And so if you fail a look test, then you should get some vital signs taken. But someone should do a visual evaluation of folks coming in. And then, as I mentioned before, a person should rest for about 20 minutes prior to returning to work. And it could be longer, but at least 20 minutes in the initial period. So that brings us to this question about whether we can really assess recovery. Like, how do we know when someone's adequately recovered? You know, is it up to them? Do we have vital signs that are going to tell us about recovery? And Dave Hostler and I go round and round about this, but I think that we've agreed of the vital signs that previously were recommended in the NFPA standard and the current standard that we have from last year, there are no vital signs recommended in parameters. There's the suggestion that you consider using vital signs as a tool for when somebody can be released from rehab or when somebody needs to go see EMS. But temperature probably doesn't give us a lot of value. Heart rate does, blood pressure does, and that may be the only two on the fireground that give us some good parameters to make judgments. To try to take a temperature on somebody on the fireground is fraught with difficulties, just like trying to take a temperature in the back of an ambulance. Measuring respiratory rate is probably, I don't know, AJ, would you say respiratory rate is the vital sign most often made up on a chart?
Yeah, for sure.
Difficult. And then pulse oximetry can be affected by carbon monoxide that's in somebody's bloodstream, unless you're using an oximeter like you see in the slide there. That's a RAD 57 that has the capability of measuring carbon monoxide. But oximetry might not be the best tool to use unless you have somebody exposed to fire smoke and you're trying to assess them for carbon monoxide poisoning. So that said, if you think about line of duty deaths, Stephanos Kales and some researchers from Harvard took a really close look at what are the common findings in line of duty death investigations. And they came up with three things, one of which is probably very important to us in rehab. Oftentimes, line of duty deaths involve people who are overweight. Oftentimes, they involve unrecognized or untreated cardiovascular disease. And oftentimes, the sole complaint of that individual was that they were tired. And I think that's something that you and I should focus on in a rehab area. When you see somebody who just says, I think I'll just go back to the station and take a nap, or I'm going to lay down here for a while, that tends to be the single complaint associated with line of duty deaths that occur in firefighters. And I think recognizing that, and if you look at number 2 there, unrecognized, untreated cardiovascular disease, how many times do firefighters get their blood pressure taken? And I think that's an important piece of looking at an individual on the fireground and trying to make a decision as a medical provider whether that person is good to go. And I think having a baseline set of vital signs, so what is that firefighter's baseline heart rate? What is that firefighter's baseline blood pressure? Solves a whole lot of problems if you're an EMT or a paramedic and you're looking at Joe Blow, who you've never seen before, but you have in front of you his baseline heart rate and his baseline blood pressure. Because maybe his blood pressure is normally super high and now he's super low. That's a sign that there's a problem. Maybe his vital signs are very close to what his baseline is. I have a couple firefighters in my department who have a baseline resting heart rate of over 110. They always live like that. And if we used a setting of, or a parameter of 100, those guys would never get out of rehab. So I think there's some things to be said here from NIOSH, but when you look at the current standard, what it's telling us is we should use the tools that we have available to us to make good clinical judgments about when people are okay to leave the fireground. And if that means heart rate and blood pressure, maybe that means using some of these other tools, so be it. But someone, a clinician on the scene, is going to have to make a decision based on knowing that individual, hopefully having some baseline data, and then deciding whether that person is able to leave the fire ground or not. And I think if you go ahead,
excuse
AJ.
me, you know, we tell you, because this gives you all the armament that you need when you're doing kind of a structured rehab to do the full set of vitals and maybe even a 12 lead on some people if you pick up an irregular pulse. You can have a heat gun. I like to use the little thermal temperature on their forehead, just to be able to see 10 minutes from now if I've been able to get their temperature down a little bit. It's not accurate all the time, but at least it'll show me that when they first gunned my head, I was at 100.2, and now I'm at 98.6. You're having an impact on me. So make sure you do those parameters. I can tell you, at least over my career, there have been many fire scenes where we found somebody who we had to send to the hospital because they were going into a crisis. And the other thing that I like to mention is when somebody sits down and tells you they have a terrible headache, you better spend some time with them because they could be pre-stroke. So, you know, all those things, if something that makes the hair on the back of your neck go up, you got to spend time with those people. And you will find maybe 1 out of 10 that has an abnormality. And you might have to ask people, what's your normal blood pressure? I don't know. Well, then you got to dig into it. But a lot of people do know what their normal blood pressure is. And they'll tell you that because they just played pickleball 6 hours ago.
And there's really no
Go ahead,
reason
Mike.
why once a year we shouldn't sit down at a drill, take everybody's blood pressure and everybody's pulse, and record that somewhere. And whether you record that in an app that you use for responding, like the I Am Responding app, or you put it in a department record, something that's accessible to folks on a fire ground would be a good way to accomplish that. Where's this
Slide that
truck?
Mike has up there is probably for me one of the best rehab organizations I know in the country. And Fame EMS in Pennsylvania, they bought a truck many years ago that had all kinds of rehab gear and MCI gear on it, and slowly over time began to be invited to go to all of the fire scenes throughout their district. And they really do a bang up job. And they've learned a lot of techniques and have a really nice rehab form. If you ever want one, contact the folks from Fame EMS and they'll share everything with you. But they know how to do it. And that slide that I showed you earlier of the snow, I was with them doing an MCI training program on a Super Bowl Sunday in the snow. And they set up tents and things, not so much to rehab in, but to be a windbreak when we were taking patients out to ambulances. So there's a lot of tricks that people can teach you that are doing good rehab.
So I wanted to, AJ, you had a really good slide with some additional tips on it. And I wondered if you could talk about the things that you listed here.
Yeah, these are, you know, I always, you know, I was famous for laminating everything, and I have laminated charts that have the heat index on one side and the wind chill on the other side. And in the upper left, there is a rehab officer checklist that just tells you what you need to be able to start to do some rehab. And then on the right is the rehab log that I use. And the only thing different about some of the standards is they don't always have a column for you to put down how much fluid you've given to somebody. So I've added that on all my stuff. But pre-existing sheets to protect the responders' confidentiality. Once in a year, you get everybody to sit down at a drill or pre-drill and take their set of vital signs, put it in kind of a confidential binder, and you keep that somewhere that you can use during rehab. And vital signs taken during hydration periods. We talked about the dry towels. You can take towels and put them up in the vehicle heater and bash location and give people a hot towel if they're really cold. And also hair dryers. You don't think they're important, but you get a firefighter who's drenched and you start to dry him off. Drying off the hair and warming up the head is a pretty significant good feeling. And we talked about all the pike poles and all the other things, but I think the charts are important. A lot of people will say, I don't know how to do rehab. I want you to be the rehab officer. Well, I don't know how to do it. Well, here's a little checklist. It's a cheat sheet. And, you know, get ice from somewhere. We've been at fire scenes where somebody would send somebody over to a shopping center across the street and they come back with a whole shopping cart full of ice, because when there's a fire, people will give you all kinds of stuff. So don't be afraid to ask for it. You'll get it.
And that's an issue that we see across the whole entire country right now, what you alluded to with personnel issues. And we're dealing with this right in my county right now, is that fire service doesn't have the manpower to set up a rehab operation on a scene. They barely have enough people to put the fire out. And so they're asking EMS to do it, who are also short staffed. So I think in many of our departments across the country, we're currently having to look to who else could do those functions for us. And, that may be a CERT team. It may be, I think what we're going to settle on here in Saratoga County, New York, is to use firefighters from departments far removed from where the fire is to come in on a mutual aid basis and set up and operate a rehab truck or rehab operation on a fire scene. And you have to use some very creative approaches, I think, and we all recognize that neither the fire service nor EMS right now has a great surplus of people to get some of these things done, but it's also essential that it get done. And I think that's figuring out how we're going to accomplish that. It is important. Obviously, a lot of things that we've talked about are things that need some additional information and some more science behind them, so that we figure out what are better ways to do things. One of the suggestions in chat here is getting the chaplain involved as part of the rehab team. And if you really read through NFPA 1584, there's a strong component in there about mental health and saying we need to be watching what's happening on the scene. And having an individual that just walks around on the fire ground and checks in with people has been shown psychologically to have this tremendous advantage, that there's an individual, a sage person who's there on the fire ground, who's caring about people, paying attention to them, taking care of some of their needs for water or rest or that sort of thing. And there's a lot to be said for a chaplain filling that role, or an older member of the department who knows everybody. I think that that's a important component of what happens on the fire ground, and we're becoming more and more aware of the mental health needs of people everywhere in emergency services. So there's a question about the ratio of sports drinks to water, and we didn't talk specifically about that, except to say that we shouldn't dilute or overly concentrate sports drinks. So generally, in the NFPA standard, it talks about using water for the first hour and a half of an incident. And once people begin to become tired, when they're coming back to rehab, maybe for the second time, the third time, that's a good opportunity for a sports drink, because now they need an energy boost, a little bit of extra sugar, some carbohydrate, which is what's in these sports drinks. And I think that that's a reasonable time to think about that. We don't always run incidences long enough for people to need to consume sports drinks. And I guess something to think about, if you consider your gastric emptying time, is if you're going to drink a couple bottles of water and then you're going to throw a sports drink down with those couple bottles of water, didn't you just dilute the sports drink with what else is in your stomach? And would that have a tendency to make you nauseous? And indeed, it often does. So we should drink water primarily. We should drink sports drinks when we're a little bit more into the incident time. So I think we've kind of talked about a way to do rehab that's going to cut down on injuries, maybe save some lives on the scene, pick up on some things that we otherwise might not pick up on. What we're trying to do is hydrate, cool people, have them rest, monitor them in some way, shape, or form. And then each of us has to sort of know our hydration status, figure out a way that we know what our personal hydration status is, and the weights and the urine color may be a good way to get a baseline for each of us. Should passively cool ourselves, rest for at least 20 minutes and let someone else look you over, because if you think you know yourself well enough, you're being foolish. Someone else needs to look at you when you're at an incident and have some sense as to how you're doing while you're there on scene. And we really know now, and this is why NFPA took recommended parameters for vital signs completely out of the standard and completely out of the annex, is that the only way to interpret vital signs is to have them be contextual. And contextual means I see them now, I know what your normals are. And so in general, unless we have a good baseline, we're not going to be able to make a lot of decisions based on vital signs when we're on the scene. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't take them. That means we should be careful what we're using them for and how we're using them. And really the hot button, as I mentioned from the NIO studies, is somebody tells you, I just feel tired. That should be a red flag on the fire ground. And then really the only safe way to make decisions is to have a clinician who can make a good clinical judgment on what's going on with the firefighter. That's the only way to be safe. And good clinical judgment is hard, because if you take a paramedic and you say, I want you to use your knowledge and your skills to tell me whether this person is okay to leave the fire ground, they're probably going to ask you what the baseline vitals are on that person. And if we don't have those, I think that's very difficult to do. And it also means that you can't take the guy who just got out of EMT school yesterday and throw him into this sort of operation, because he has no clinical judgment. So I think those are important points to keep in mind in this sort of operation. And all of us should really study what we do so that we can come up with better and better iterations of this. Every time we go through a revision of the NFPA standard, we take research that's been done between then and now and say, how are we going to improve this standard? So I think
I just want to say, it's never too late to do rehab. You might be arriving as a mutual aid ambulance to support a fire scene, and you say, well, I got there after the knockdown had occurred. Well, that's just about the time that we're really going to need rehab, because that's when the firefighters are going to be the most exhausted. So you can start that. I recently started to do an article on a fella from my dad's former fire department in Scranton, PA. He was dispatched mutual aid to a brush fire, which was way up in the mountains outside the Scranton. And he was a fire captain working real hard. And on every alarm, they send their rescue truck, Rescue One. And those guys are, trained to start to do rehab and assessment and carry an AED. And just when he came out from the hardest working part of the incident, he dropped in cardiac arrest. And they resuscitated him right there, and he's back to work already. So they didn't get there for 20 minutes, but that still didn't mean that they didn't save his life. Had they not been there way out in the wilderness, never would have been a survivor. So it's never too late. We're doing rehab, not just because we'd like somebody to do it for us, but we're doing it because we care about the people and we want them to be able to do what they like to do. If I get to a fire scene and I do the first attack, I'd like the honor to go in and pull the ceiling, but I can't do that if I don't do rehab. So you'll have firefighters that'll grumble to you, and all you do is you tell Siri to alert you in 20 minutes and tell them that when the 20-minute alarm goes off, you're going back in. And unless you find something wrong, you've cooled that person, him or her, giving them a couple drinks. And just a word about the sports drinks. I'll drink vinegar before I'll drink a sports drink. So I like to say to people, do you like sports drinks? And if they say yes, I hand them one. If they say no, then they get lots of water, because there's nothing worse than giving somebody something to drink that tastes like NyQuil. Appreciate all your time, and I wish you all great success in implementing some of these things. Mike and I have all kinds of things we could share with you. You'll be getting an email from Provident, and you'll have our email addresses on there, and anything we can ever do to help you, we'd be glad to do.
All right, well, Gents, I want to thank you both for the webinar tonight. I just want to look down through some of the Q&A quick. Wayne Martin, what about CERT? Or we have a 70 or 7B CARES faith base to assist in assets that might be available. Wayne, depending on where you're at in the country, your fire department or EMS service may or may not know about your 7B CARES, and go knock on the door and let them know that you're willing to give them a hand on a major incident with that kind of stuff.
Great idea.
Wayne, also, how important is it? This is Wayne Grimsley. How important is an initial decon of carcinogens from the firefighting during rehab?
Very, very important. And one of the things that this current version of 1584 says is that absolute minimum, you should do a dry or a wet decon and then use wipes to clean the areas that we all know, the back of your neck, your wrists, places where we know that contaminants are getting into your gear, onto your skin. And at minimum, we should do the wet or the dry decon and use some wipes before you go into rehab.
Well, I guess maybe even in lieu of that, if you had to, just taking your gear off outside before you enter the rehab tent, and before you enter the rehab tent, should do the wipe down with with the baby wipes or whatever you're using, rather than a wet decon prior to entering rehab. Because let's face it, some of us are short enough people. If we can get somebody into rehab and get them cleared, I want them back outside and put their gear on and going back to work. So I don't really want to soak that stuff at that point. But
good point.
Let's see what else is down here.
Just remember, nobody invites us to come to their nice, clean environment. There's carcinogens and everything, and we can't be taking that stuff, particularly home.
Right. And the thing, the idea is to reduce the exposure. We all know we're not going to completely eliminate it, but the idea of a guy, a firefighter coming out of after he's gone in and knocked the fire down, takes his breathing apparatus off and walks straight into rehab with all that gear on him. Let's face it, that it used to happen, and it probably still happens in some places. But we reduce the exposure, the cross contamination in the tent and with our friends from EMS by just taking the gear off outside and wiping down a little bit. There's Ben Shapiro wants to know any sources for the switch from sugar-free to high octane sports drink, and then the NFPA. Would love to check it out to see the current standard.
Yeah, I think if you read the current 1584 online, and you could read it online, you just can't download it. It gives some rationale for that. And when we say sports drinks, we're talking about a specific amount of carbohydrate in the drink. So it's not really high octane. It's just that there's carbohydrate in it. And the reason for that is that the sugar-free drinks were all made under the premise that all you needed was the electrolytes. And as that's been researched, the electrolytes are secondary to the sugar. And so the carbohydrate is an energy boost for the firefighter. The electrolytes may or may not really actually be necessary. And so if you take the carbohydrate out of the drink, you just eliminate what we know has value in that sports drink.
Okay. So there's
I want to close. I'd just like to close by addressing the anonymous attendees question, because it's probably one of the most important. And that's how you deal with those who argue with you when you get them into rehab. When I was at Citroni Ambulance, we supported 10 different fire departments. We were an independent EMS agency. And when I wrote our rehab guidelines, I went to all 10 fire departments and made it their rehab guidelines as well. So each fire chief co-signed it. So when a medic or an EMT said to somebody, you need to come over to rehab in a nice way, that held the weight of an SOP in their fire department. It has to be something that becomes ingrained, sometimes by a protocol, but usually just by a nice, good-looking rehab area with a nice, cool drink, an exhaust fan set up, You know, it's a party type environment. Sit down, we'll change your air tank for you. And by the time you're done, you'll have some water and you can go back into the fire. If you get people used to that, they'll look for you at every fire scene.
You know, at the end of the day, it's about leadership. That's what it boils down to. And, you know, I said this today to somebody, and I'll say it again. Everybody wants to be a fire chief until it comes time to do fire chief things. And then it all seems to change. I can remember several years ago here in Mifflin County, we were practicing at rehab. And I'll probably never forget this, nor will anybody else let me forget it. There was a young lad sitting in rehab, said to a paramedic, "Hey, water girl, get me another glass of water." And my head nearly exploded. And I can assure you, he never made that statement to anybody in rehab after that. So I was a little agitated when I heard that. Let's make sure we didn't miss anything in chat. Looks like we're pretty much have everything covered here. Someone asked about drip drop packets. I've tried some of those. I find them to be really sweet, but I don't know how well they do as far as helping with rehydration. Mike, any?
I have a little bit of experience with them, and I think that they fill a niche. And you know, people ask this about sports drinks too. If you ever walk down the sports drink aisle in your supermarket, you're like, oh my God, I don't even know where to begin picking these. And here's the way you pick them: price and taste. And just like AJ said, if you don't like the taste of something, you're not drinking it. And you know, drip drop fills a niche, and it may be something that's useful to your department. It may not. I think it's portable, it's easily mixed. So there are departments that find it to be very useful for their purposes.
Well, I don't see anything more in Q&A. So with that being said, I want to thank you both again for a great presentation. I can see the comments in here. A lot of our viewers are posting the same thing. I do want to point out one thing, Mike, you talked about if someone says they're tired. Okay. And you mentioned it, and I know the studies have been done. The same goes when you get back to the station. If somebody's telling you they don't feel well, they don't go home. You need to send them to the hospital. And because the number of people who have died within 24 to 48 hours after returning from a call, and they even told people at the station, I don't feel well, it seems like it increases every year. So please, folks, if someone's telling you they don't feel well or they're tired, even once they get back to the station, ship them off to the hospital. And if it's a false alarm, it's a false alarm. But I'd rather it be a false alarm than you find out the next day you could have prevented somebody's line of duty death. So let me get back on the agenda here. So if you have any questions or need additional resources from today, or you have an idea for your future webinar, please email us at info@providentins.com. We'll get back to you as soon as we can. I want to remind our audience there'll be a short survey that we would like you to complete. And keep an eye open in your email from me over the next day or two that will have your certificate attached. Please check your spam folders before you send me an email telling me you didn't get your certificate. Tonight's episode will be uploaded to the Provident YouTube page. Also, when Sam sends out the links to everything, you'll have a copy of a PDF for the PowerPoint tonight, and you'll have the links to all the recordings as well. Please also check out the podcast that we've recorded through your favorite podcast app. Do a Google search for Station 1902. We'll provide you with the links you need. Join us again on September 27th at 7 p.m. when Bruce Borgi from Lexipol will join us to discuss the consequences of the failure to lead. Until then, stay safe.